Most people outside of the hardcore strength training and exercise science world probably won't be familiar with the term hypertrophy, let alone contractile and sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So what are these two dimensions of hypertrophy and how do they relate to the much more elusive, at least in practice, notion of hyperplasia?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot to unpack there, but hypertrophy is the growth of tissue, and specifically muscle skeletal hypertrophy is the growth of muscle, skeletal muscle. Generally speaking, there are two ways that muscles can hypertrophy. They can hypertrophy in parallel, which is kind of like adding, and this is adding what are called sarcomeres, which are the smallest functional unit of a muscle. And when you add sarcomeres, the muscle grows. You can add them in parallel, which is kind of like sardines in a can where they're next to each other, where the sarcomeres are added next to each other, or they can be added in series, which is like links in a chain. For the most part, in parallel hypertrophy is the primary way that muscles grow, particularly over long periods of time. There's some evidence that in the short term, like early phases of a resistance training program, you can have in series hypertrophy. There's some other evidence, which is still, I think, somewhat controversial, that certain types of training programs, even at an advanced level, can cause in series hypertrophy. But the primary way, by most evidence that we have now, is through in parallel hypertrophy. Hyperplasia is where muscles divide, where muscle cells, fibers divide and become more fibers. So one fiber can make two can make four, and et cetera, et cetera. There's limited evidence that can occur. There's some avian evidence, bird models that have been shown, but they use really extreme protocols as well as some rodent models where they do things like they cut off a certain muscle, like the gastrocnemius, and then you could see huge increases in muscle development. With the birds, they put the wing in a stretch, and they look at the latissimus dorsi, and they do this for days on end with little weights hanging off their wings that are, up to 30% of the bird's weight. So just really extreme protocols that obviously humans would never go through.
Mm-hmm.
And they've shown pretty extreme hyperplasia from that. But the working model that we have now is that when muscles reach a certain point, they can no longer functionally grow anymore. And at that point, they can hypertrophy. The thing is, it doesn't seem that in traditional type of training programs under traditional conditions, which I'll get to in a minute, that really happens to any large extent in humans. Where it does seem to at least be possible, if not likely to occur, is when people take anabolic hormones. So when they're taking pharmacological aids, which cause their growth to be really extreme, beyond which you can achieve naturally. And at that point, conceivably, you would reach a point where the muscles would have to divide to continue to be functionally solvent.
So you mentioned the contractile hypertrophy. So that's when you add sarcomeres in series or in parallel. And you said that that's the primary way in which humans experience hypertrophy. How does sarcoplasmic hypertrophy factor into human hypertrophy?
So sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is the hypertrophy of non-contractile elements. So the contraction of a muscle, which is the functional way a muscle shortens and lengthens, is predicated on various contractile proteins, such as actin, myosin, titin is one that's come into play. There are other proteins within fibers. Mitochondria are contained within muscle fibers. There are T-tubules. There are various other proteins that are involved. And it should be noted that so the muscle likes to maintain or seeks to maintain a certain ratio of fluid to proteins. And this is a way that conceivably a muscle can not only add these non-contractile proteins, but it also would draw conceivably additional fluid into the cell, water into the cell to support the functional validity of the muscle fiber. And it's somewhat controversial to the if it occurs, and I think the emerging evidence that it certainly does occur. When I say it does occur? Certainly it occurs, but does it occur over and above contractile, what you'd see with contractile elements? Of course, you're going to get non-contractile hypertrophy, and you can do that through aerobic training, can cause sarcoplasmic growth. But the question is, can you see it over and above where specifically it would happen at a substantially greater rate than you would see with the contractile hypertrophy? And even more importantly, is there a particular type of training approach that might lend itself to that? And I think there is some emerging evidence that shows that may be the case. I'm certainly not willing to stake my reputation on that at this point. I think that we still have a long way to go to really understand it better. But there is, again, some emerging evidence that does seem to show that training in a higher volume with lighter loads can, to some extent, shift the processes towards greater sarcoplasmic growth. And I do want to point out, though, that doesn't mean when you do that, you don't get contractile growth. So you get contractile growth, but you will get conceivably sarcoplasmic growth over and above which you would from, let's say, heavier load training. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the working theory now. I would say the theory is still somewhat weak to modest. Certainly, we don't have strong evidence that does occur, and to the extent and how. And really, these are things that we'd like to think that we're in a very advanced stage of research where we know all these things, and we're still, in my opinion, in our infancy of really uncovering a lot of these explorations.